It's great. I thought, what the heck, let's give a little bit on this. So I kind of hit Ari up at the last minute when I knew we had an uneven number of presentations. And I thought it would be good to sort of generally end on the hour and then do a wrap up. So I'm like, hey, well, here's one we could do. Let me talk a little bit about what we did here. So this protocol was basically 7 well-established transmitters. I mean, very, very good. One could say well-known, if not, in some cases, quite famous. In other cases, just very well-known in a certain community, like a certain, tradition with maybe like, tens of millions or whatever of adherents, that kind of thing. What we were really curious about was, could we detect something in spiritual transmission? Could we see, just even with subjective self-reports initially, we thought we would wind our way in, do physiological measurements after this, that type of thing. I totally and fully expected that this would be a rich data set. I totally expected there to be spiritual transmission that we detected. I thought the patterns, I thought I could guess at the patterns and what they would be. But this actually is a hallmark of my empirical work, because there have been many times when I thought I knew it was the case and it wound up not being the case when you actually put it to the test. And I think that's one of the most important things about science. No matter how much of an expert you are on this, that, or the other thing, or not an expert, just biased or educated or whatever, you have to put it to the test. And you have to put it to the test as rigorously and as good as you can. And so I wanted to create a very tight protocol. It was very hard dealing with the schedules of these 7 people. They're in demand, right? And so it was difficult. There were really, challenges in just, trying to get the thing organized in the first place with good enough people such that you knew at the end of it, that you would probably have a result, which of course you're going to find out today we didn't really. So here's the way we set this up. It ran from February 21st to April 8th of this year. And there were basically 4 distinct hour-long sessions per week. Those hour-long sessions were divided into 2 20-minute sessions, basically. And so let's say a session started at the top of the hour. Transmitter 1, right, would transmit from the top of the hour to 20 minutes after the hour. And then there would be a gap during which academic measures and stuff were filled out and, feedback was given on that person's transmission session or whatever. And then the final 20 minutes of the hour, there would be another transmission with a different transmitter. And so, we counterbalanced the transmitters as best we could. People to participate in it had to agree to one of the 4, to be consistent across one of the 4 weeks of the experiment so that we could make sure that they had gone through every transmitter twice. But they were also, if they wanted to, allowed to take as many of the other sessions as they wanted, as long as we made sure that they all experienced a transmitter twice. That's all we really cared about. And the best way to do that was to basically just have them all, ensure that if you did one day over these 7 weeks, if you were always doing the Monday, session at 9 o'clock or something, right? That, over the course of the 7 weeks, you would basically get each person twice. We also mixed in placebo. At the beginning, we did not tell people we mixed in placebo. And towards the end, we told people that we mixed in placebo. And so there was no expectation of placebo at the beginning, of a session potentially being placebo. People thought that all sessions were transmitters. And towards the end, they then knew that they could have been a transmitter, could not have been a transmitter. The part of the reason that it was done in 2 people per session was because of scheduling. It just was very hard to get people scheduled and day conflicts and stuff like that, but also because we thought it would be interesting to see if there was a compounding effect, or if there was, you know, the first session was more or less powerful than the second session, or did it, you know, if you had a transmitter in the first session and a placebo session in the second session, did that mean that, you know, the effect from the first session carried over for some people or whatever percentage of people to the second session? Was there a difference if the placebo was in the first session? You know, all of those types of things. Some transmitter pairs, you know, seem more powerful when in conjunction with each other than others. And we collected an enormous amount of data. We collected people's opinions. We collected their moods before and after transmissions, sort of their sense of self. We had huge amounts of surveys that were done on their beliefs and well-being and just you name it, prior to all transmissions and after all transmissions. And so we really collected an enormous amount of data. And because of that, actually, there was so much data that I had difficulty getting people to analyze it. I don't do much data analysis anymore just because I don't have much time. And so we outsource almost all of that to people who, you know, do it for a living, basically. And none of the people that we normally use. It was just too much data. They just didn't have time to tackle the project. And so finally, out of his good graces, Ari Berwaldt tackled it for us. Ari was our main data analyst for most of the Finder's Course project. He worked basically full-time on the project at the lab in Palo Alto, day in, day out. He probably knows that data better than anyone. And so he was nice enough, and he actually, you know, I was at Houston, Illinois at the time, a lake house there. It's a family house of mine. And we wound up basically just camping out there. He flew out and camped out for a couple of weeks, and we just dug into this data. And, you know, like I said, my bias, there's an experimenter bias here. The experimenter bias was certain that we would find data validating, you know, our various hypotheses. And as we dug in, as you'll see, we really didn't. There was no physical or electronic connection between transmitters. Participants were basically just asked to sit and remain open, you know, to the transmissions. They were asked not to meditate if at all possible. One thing that distinguished this group is that we chose to test people who were in fundamental well-being. And so we piggybacked this on an advanced program that we were doing for people in fundamental well-being. And the thought was that over the years, those people had seemed most sensitive to these types of transmissions. And so we even did that to sort of try to increase the sensitivity of it. Not everyone was in fundamental well-being, but the vast majority of people were. Okay, so I'm going to have Ari go through, and he can, if you can unmute Ari and say hi, and then just tell me when you want me to change slides, and I'll just go ahead and we'll start with the first slide that you've prepared here.
All right, hello everybody.
We can hear you.
Great. So unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of lead time to really prepare all the data for presentation. So whatever we're going to be showing you today right now is just a tiny slice of, I guess, some of the more surprising findings. So I'm not going to try doing a screen share, but kind of to preface this, there were, as Jeffrey said, tons of different questions asked pre and post. And looking overall, regardless of the teacher, if it was an actual teacher or placebo, the pre and post changes for these individual sessions were very statistically significant for things like, you know, happiness would increase, sinking into fundamental well-being would increase. But in some ways, to answer the question, the main question here, which is, was there a difference between a person or people rating sessions done by an actual teacher versus rating the session that was actually a placebo. And so getting into that, this first slide, we have the overall transmission rating. And as you can see, you know, people thought that the transmissions overall were good, but they rated placebo the same as the actual teachers. So it seems as if there was really no distinguishing characteristic there. Next slide. Right, so this was another question asked after each transmission session. And as you can see, again, placebo over here on the far left, and then the teachers on the right. There was really no significant difference. You know, you see the average rating for all the teachers, average rating for placebo. The error bars all significantly overlap. So from a statistical standpoint, we can't conclude that there's any difference between any of the teachers compared to any of the other teachers, and also no difference between any teacher compared to the placebo. And let's go to the next slide.
Can you see it?
I think my video is delayed.
Okay. It's change. If you want to just go off your local slides, you can. It's change and rate your experience of well-being in this moment.
Okay. Well, the truth is, what I'm going to say for all the slides is basically the same. So, yeah, and if you pay attention closely, you can see that how individual teachers did relative to each other, relative to placebo, you know, changes a little bit based on the particular question asked, but the trend, the general trend of essentially no distinction between a teacher and placebo holds throughout all of them. And now, so there's only a few questions up here in the presentation. We also ran a lot of other questions.
So here's another one. It says, change in how sunk into fundamental well-being in this moment. Go ahead, right. Ari. They asked me to read the titles because they're hard to read.
So we asked other questions as well, a whole slew of them. And occasionally we would get a particular question that would show a statistically significant difference. But when you have what's called the multiple comparisons, since we're comparing so many possible questions at the 95% confidence interval, it's actually likely that if you compare enough things, one of them will randomly come out as looking significant. So yeah, really there's not much that can be concluded from this.
It's change and quote, overall my mood is, unquote, on a scale of 1 to 10.
Yeah, so I think someone asked, let's see, someone just asked the question.
All right, so you get the idea there. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, so it's hard to say, but for some of the questions, like the 1 to 10, where most of the ratings were up at the 8s or the 9s, we are running into possible ceiling effects there. But yes.
We did look at things like that, incidentally. Somebody asked me, what is a transmission? I think Amance, maybe. Hi, Amance, by the way. So the 20-minute thing was actually from teachers. I surveyed the teachers and asked them how long they wanted one to be. Actually, one teacher, most of them were like, that's about how long they wanted it to be. There were a couple of variances from that, mostly lower. So there were a couple of people I talked into transmitting a little longer than they might otherwise. And we actually even tried to get some diversity in that. And so, you notice there were 6 plus placebo on those charts. 2 of them were done as a couple. There was a couple that did transmissions. And so we tested a couple. We tested one person who believed that sort of spiritual progression was done mostly by healing, by sort of, deep healing that would be produced in the person's system. There was a lot of people who were, just basically believed that you either attained a certain state, you just went into sort of a certain state, and that, you held that field for everyone, so to speak. So that type of thing. There was a couple of people who worked with beings and are very, very big into working with, tons of angels and things like that. And so we put in a fair amount of diversity on that as well. Let's see, what else? Let's see what other questions you guys have here. Let's see here. Why not meditate during the transmission? Maybe meditation is important for the transmission. We knew that some people would, just by default, when sitting for 20 minutes, go into meditation mode, and others wouldn't. So the ones that couldn't, we thought, well, at least we'll get a mix there, and we can ask them about it later. And if it turns out that, the people that said, well, I really can't not meditate, had some effect versus the other people that were just sitting there being open, that could have told us something, but it was just irrelevant. There were so many things like that that were just irrelevant. Yeah, so that was one of the thoughts. MT, let me see what's your name is Martin. The reason that these transmitters may have had poor results in this experiment is that there was no connection or resonance of any sort between the transmitters and the receivers. So one thing that we did do is we had all of the participants submit a photo of themselves, and so their name, photo were basically provided to the transmitters, and then people signed up for each of the transmissions, and so then the transmitters got the list of names of the people that signed up for each transmission, and they could of course match those to the pictures if they wanted to or whatever else. And so there was a connection like that was provided from the transmitter side. From the participant side, they were just completely blinded. They didn't know anything about them. They still don't know anything about them, actually. So yeah, so the receivers never had any idea who the transmitters were, but the transmitters did know who the people were that had signed up for their thing. Maybe the placebo is too good or the transmitters are too mediocre. One of the fascinating things is that, they were like, it didn't matter because it wasn't significant in the numbers, but it was sort of funny in that, like, there were like half the teachers that were better than placebo and half the teachers where you would have been better off, like, or half the transmitters, not teachers, basically just getting placebo sessions. So that was kind of weird. Yeah, potential effect of participants creating a mesh network. I think, one of the things that Ari didn't say is that a lot of people felt nothing. And so we also looked at people who more consistently felt nothing than others, and whether there was a difference between that and placebo or not. And so if there wasn't like everybody just experienced a certain amount of awesomeness. There were many people who didn't experience much of anything from the transmitters, or maybe did a little bit here and there, in which case it was as likely to be from a placebo as from not. So it was, we really dug into stuff like this. It was really surprising. Yeah, Thomas, I think it's a good question. What if selecting people already in fundamental well-being caused a lack of a result? That would be a pretty interesting finding in and of itself. given the lore around spiritual transmission and people that are in fundamental well-being and their, you know, sort of the dogma that's been built up around that in various traditions and all kinds of stuff. Or a reason for the poor results is that transmission was always just a marketing tool. That's kind of funny. I don't know quite what you mean on that one, Sean. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little further down. Let's see. What was the placebo? The placebo was literally nothing. And so, you know, there was nobody from our side that did anything at all. It was just a scheduled time when nothing occurred, basically. Let's see. Yeah, and so one of the interesting things around this resonance argument keeps coming up, right? And one of the things is that of course, a lot in the transmission game insists that that type of resonance isn't necessary. And so that allowed us to test a nice tight protocol. It's a question of how could you test it without people seeing them or hearing them. Of course, the minute you introduce effects like that, if you're familiar at all with the experimenter effects literature, it becomes very hard to believe anything. The duties of the transmitters were to, you know, basically do their thing live during the scheduled window that they were assigned, stopping at the appropriate time and all of that. Yeah, Malcolm, it's a good point. One of the things that I've commented on very favorably in the past is Bengston's method, which is a transmission method. It does seem to be a transmission method. He doesn't touch anybody when he does this thing. He just runs the little loops in the back of his head and all of that. And there seems to be really good evidence for that. That's the interesting thing about this, is that there is really interesting evidence. And of course, a lot of people believe that they experience these types of things. I believe it, right? I believe it. And so we're just starting with this, but I thought it was a really interesting, really surprising kind of thing. Okay, I think that's it. It's on the hour. Thank you, Ari, for being willing to pop in at the last minute. Imans, next year you can give a talk on transmission, and we'll see if we can pick it apart. Maybe you and I can have a conversation. We'll record it and put it out there one way or the other.